Moses. You know the name. Everybody knows the name. He talked to God the way you talk to a friend across the table, face to face, like two people in a room. He walked into the throne room of the most powerful empire on earth and said, "Let my people go." He raised a staff over the Red Sea, and the waters ripped apart like fabric. He climbed a mountain that was on fire and came back down carrying stone tablets inscribed by the finger of God himself. If there is a Mount Rushmore of the Bible, Moses isn't just on it. He is the mountain. So here is a question that should bother you. Can you name his sons? Take a second. Think about it. You know Moses married Zipporah. You might remember that detail. But his kids, the boys who grew up in his tent, who ate meals at his table, who watched their father become the most important leader in human history. Nothing. Blank. Total silence. And that is not your fault, because the Bible itself barely mentions them. 2 sons, named in passing, then nothing. Complete, thundering silence for the rest of the Old Testament narrative. No stories about their childhood, no record of their opinions, no account of their deaths, no legacy chapter. Nothing. His name is mentioned over 800 times across the Bible. More than Abraham, more than every prophet combined. Only David gets more airtime. His name is sacred in Judaism, revered in Christianity, honored in Islam. More books and commentaries have been written about Moses than about almost any other figure in human history. 3,000 years after his death, people still argue about what he meant, what he saw, and what he wrote. And yet his own sons are footnotes. Their names are Gershom and Eliezer. And if those names mean absolutely nothing to you right now, that is the whole point of this video. Because those names are not just labels. In Hebrew, names are not what we think of as names in the modern world. In ancient Hebrew culture, a name was a declaration, a prophecy, an emotional confession spoken over a child at the moment of their birth. And when you understand what Gershom and Eliezer mean in the original Hebrew, you start to see something disturbing about the man who named them. Gershom comes from the Hebrew word ger, which means stranger, foreigner, or sojourner, someone who does not belong. When Moses named his firstborn son, he was not browsing a baby name book. He was making a public declaration about his own psychological state. Exodus chapter 2, verse 22 records it plainly. Moses said, "I have become a stranger in a foreign land." He had just fled Egypt after killing a man. He was a fugitive prince with a death sentence on his head, sitting in a desert country he had never seen before, married into a family that was not his people, herding sheep that were not his sheep, living a life that was not the life he was supposed to live. And the first thing he does when his son is born is name the boy after his own displacement. Imagine that for a second. You are holding your newborn baby for the first time, that tiny face, those tiny fingers, and the name you choose, the word that will follow this child for the rest of his life, is basically, "I don't belong here." That is not a name. That is a wound pressed into another person's identity. The second son, Eliezer, gets even less attention in the text. His birth is barely noted. His name means, "My God is my help." And Exodus chapter 18 verse 4 gives us the reasoning behind it. Moses said, "The God of my father was my help, and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh." Again, the name is not about the child. It is not about his future, his potential, his personhood. It is about Moses. It is about what God did for Moses. Both sons are named after their father's trauma and their father's rescue. Neither name says anything about the boy himself. Gershom means, "I am lost." Eliezer means, "God saved me." Both names point to the father. The sons are invisible even in their own naming ceremonies. And if you are paying attention, if you are reading this the way a detective reads a case file, you can already see the pattern forming. These 2 boys exist in the shadow of a father whose mission was so enormous, so consuming, so world historically significant that even their names point away from them and toward him. This is our first piece of evidence. File it away. We are going to need it later. Now here is where it gets genuinely strange, because in the ancient Near East, sons were not just family. Sons were legacy. Sons were survival. Your name endured through your sons. Your land passed to your sons. Your place in the community, your tribal status, your covenant standing with God, all of it traveled through the male line. This was not a cultural preference. This was the operating system of the entire ancient world. A man without sons had no future. A man whose sons were insignificant had a diminished future. And a man whose sons simply vanished from the record. That was nearly unthinkable. And Moses, the greatest leader Israel ever produced, the man who received the Torah directly from the mouth of God, his sons get essentially nothing in the narrative. No leadership role, no priestly appointment, no prophetic calling, no major story, no recorded dialogue, no legacy passage. Compare this to every other major patriarch in the Bible. Abraham's entire narrative arc revolves around his sons. The covenant with God hinges on Isaac's birth. The near sacrifice on Mount Moriah is the climax of Abraham's story, and it is entirely about his son. Isaac's story revolves around Jacob and Esau, their conflict, their competition for the blessing, their reconciliation. These brothers drive the plot forward for chapters. Jacob has 12 sons, and they become the 12 tribes of Israel. Each one gets a blessing in Genesis 49. Each one gets a story. Each one has descendants who matter. David has Solomon, and the entire kingdom passes through that line. Solomon builds the temple. Solomon's wisdom becomes legendary. David's son is the continuation of David's glory. But Moses, the man who towers above all of them, his sons are ghosts. They haunt the margins of the text. They appear for a verse, maybe two, and then they dissolve into silence like breath on a cold morning. So what happened? Where did Gershom and Eliezer go? Why does the most detailed biography in the Old Testament have a gaping hole where the family chapter should be? That is what we are going to investigate, and I need to tell you up front. The answer is not simple. It is not comfortable. And when we finally get to what happened to Moses' grandson in the book of Judges, you are going to understand why ancient Jewish scribes literally changed a letter in the sacred text to try to cover it up. Let's start at the beginning, in the desert, in Midian, with a man who had just lost everything he thought he was. When Moses fled Egypt, he was not the hero of the Exodus yet. He was not the lawgiver, or the prophet, or the man who split the sea. He was a murderer running from justice. He had seen an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave. Something in him snapped. He looked left, looked right, made sure nobody was watching. And he killed the Egyptian, buried the body in the sand. The next day, he tried to break up a fight between two Hebrew men, and one of them threw it back in his face. "Are you going to kill me the way you killed the Egyptian?" That is when Moses realized his secret was not a secret. Pharaoh heard about it. A death warrant went out. So Moses ran. Picture him arriving in Midian. No army, no staff of God, no burning bush, no promise, no plan. Just a man in his late 30s or early 40s who had been a prince that morning and was a fugitive by nightfall. He had been educated in the finest schools of the Egyptian empire, trained in literature, diplomacy, military strategy, the arts, the sciences. He had eaten from golden plates and slept in royal chambers. And now he is sitting by a well in a country he has never visited, watching strangers water their animals, knowing he can never go back to the only life he has ever known. The palace is gone. His Egyptian mother is gone. His Hebrew roots are dangerous. He belongs nowhere. This is the man who meets Zipporah. The story in Exodus chapter 2 is almost romantic by biblical standards. Zipporah and her sisters come to the well to water their father Jethro's flocks. Some local shepherds start pushing them around, cutting in line, harassing them. Moses steps in. Even as a man with nothing, he cannot stand watching injustice. He drives the shepherds away and helps the women water their flocks. Zipporah's father hears about this stranger who defended his daughters. He invites Moses to dinner. He offers him a place in the household, and eventually he gives Moses his daughter Zipporah as a wife. And Moses settles. He becomes a shepherd in his father-in-law's household. He starts a family. Gershom is born. Then Eliezer. And for roughly 40 years, this is his life: tending sheep, raising children, walking the same desert trails day after day, living in Midian as exactly what his son's name says he feels: a stranger in a foreign land. 40 years. That is not a gap year or a sabbatical or a season of wandering before the real thing starts. That is an entire adult lifetime. Moses spent as long in Midian as most people spend in their entire working career. He was a father for decades, a husband for decades, a member of Jethro's household for decades. Think about everything that happens in 40 years. Children are born, grow up, become adults. Seasons blur together. The same trails get walked 1,000 times. The same wells get visited. The same sheep get herded to the same pastures. For a man who grew up in a palace, who studied with the greatest scholars of the ancient world, who was trained to command armies and govern provinces, this life must have felt like wearing a suit 3 sizes too small. Every single day. And yet this is where his sons grew up. Gershom and Eliezer did not know palace life. They did not know Egypt. They knew Midian. They knew their grandfather Jethro's tents. They knew goat milk and flatbread and the dry wind coming off the desert. They knew a father who, by every indication the text gives us, never fully settled into the life he was living with them. There is a modern concept that therapists talk about called ambiguous loss. It describes the experience of having someone physically present but psychologically absent. The parent who is in the house but whose mind is always somewhere else. The spouse who sits at the dinner table but is emotionally 1,000 miles away. You cannot grieve their absence because they are technically right there, but you cannot connect with them either. They are present and gone at the same time. I think Gershom and Eliezer grew up with a father experiencing ambiguous loss. Moses was physically in Midian. He showed up, he tended sheep, he came home at night. But his identity, his sense of self, his inner compass, all of that was pointing somewhere else. The names prove it. 40 years in, and he is still naming his children after the place he left, not the place he is. And the question that almost nobody asks is this: what kind of father was he during those 40 years? The text does not tell us directly. There is no passage that says Moses was a good father or Moses was a distant father. But the names tell us something the text will not say out loud. A man who names his firstborn, "I am a stranger here," is a man who has not made peace with where he is. He is not settled. He is not present. He is living in Midian, but his mind is somewhere else. Maybe Egypt, maybe some imagined future, maybe just a fog of regret and displacement. But he is not here. And a man who names his second son, "God rescued me from Pharaoh," is a man who is still mentally processing the trauma of his flight from Egypt. Still rehearsing the escape. Still defining himself by what he left behind rather than by what is in front of him. Both names point backward, neither name points forward. And if you are a child, what you need most from your parent is someone who is present, someone who is here, someone whose eyes are on you, not on the horizon. If you have ever had a parent who was in the house but not in the room, physically present but emotionally somewhere else entirely, you know what that does to a child. You grow up feeling like background noise. You grow up feeling like the supporting cast in someone else's movie. And the silence around Gershom and Eliezer, their complete absence from the narrative that follows, might be telling us more about the emotional reality of Moses' household than we are comfortable admitting. Then comes the call. Exodus chapter 3. Moses is 80 years old. Let that number register. 80. He has been in Midian for 4 decades. His sons are grown men by now. Whatever dreams Moses once had about his identity, his purpose, his connection to the Hebrew people, those dreams have had 40 years to fade. 40 years of silence from the God of his fathers. 40 years of nothing except sheep and sand, and a name he gave his son that whispered, "I don't belong here," every time he said it. Moses is out tending Jethro's sheep near Mount Horeb when he sees something that should not exist. A bush is on fire, but it is not burning up. The flames dance, but the branches do not blacken. The leaves do not curl. The fire sustains itself without consuming anything. When you read this story, the natural instinct is to focus on the miracle, the supernatural fire. But I want you to notice something else. The text says, Moses turned aside to see. He could have kept walking. He could have dismissed it as a desert mirage. He could have been so numbed by 40 years of routine that he did not bother investigating something unusual. But he turned aside. And that small decision, that willingness to be curious when everything in his life had gone flat, changed human history. God speaks from inside the bush. Moses, Moses, here I am. Take off your sandals. The ground where you are standing is holy. And then the assignment. Go back to Egypt. Go back to the place you fled. Go back to the Pharaoh who wants you dead. Confront the most powerful ruler on earth. Demand that he release his entire slave labor force, the economic engine of the Egyptian empire, and let them walk into the desert. Moses argues. He floods God with objections. Who am I to go to Pharaoh? What if they ask your name? What if they don't believe me? I'm not eloquent. I'm slow of speech and slow of tongue. He basically throws every excuse he can think of at the burning bush. And God answers every single one. He gives Moses signs. He gives him Aaron as a spokesman. He gives him a staff that turns into a serpent. He gives him the divine name, I am who I am, to carry as his credential. But notice what Moses does not say during this entire conversation. He does not say, what about my family? He does not say, I have a wife and 2 sons, God. What happens to them? He does not negotiate for their safety. He does not ask if they should come along. He does not mention them at all. The burning bush conversation goes on for 2 full chapters. Moses asks about his own inadequacy, his own speech problems, his own fear. But his family, they are not part of the conversation about the mission. And that silence is the second piece of evidence. A man receiving the most important assignment in human history does not even mention his children. File it. Exodus chapter 4 tells us that Moses takes his wife and sons and starts the journey toward Egypt, so they do come along initially. But then something happens on the road that is one of the most disturbing, confusing, and heavily debated passages in the entire Bible. 3 verses, that is all it gets. 3 verses that have generated 3,000 years of scholarly argument. Exodus chapter 4, verses 24 through 26. Moses stops at a lodging place for the night, and the text says, in Hebrew, that the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. The word is hamito, to kill, to cause to die. God just called Moses, just gave him the mission, just promised to be with him, just performed miracles to convince him, and now at a random inn on the road to Egypt, God shows up to kill him, and it is Zipporah who saves the situation. Not Moses. Zipporah grabs a flint knife. She takes the sharp stone and circumcises their son, right there, in the middle of the night at the inn. She takes the bloody foreskin and touches it to Moses' feet. The Hebrew for feet here, raglav, is widely understood by scholars as a euphemism. She touches it to Moses' body as an act of substitutionary ritual, and she says something haunting. You are a bridegroom of blood to me. The Hebrew phrase is chatan damim. Chatan, bridegroom or son-in-law. Damim, bloods, plural. This is a woman who has just performed emergency surgery on her own child because her husband failed to do what the covenant required, and her words carry anger, exhaustion, maybe even disgust. Then God withdraws. Moses lives. There is enormous debate about the details here. Which son was uncircumcised? Most scholars say Eliezer, the younger son, because Gershom would likely have been circumcised at birth, but we do not know for certain. Why had Moses not done it himself? Was it Zipporah's objection as a Midianite woman unfamiliar with the practice? Was it Moses' own negligence? Was he trying to assimilate into Midianite culture and skip the Hebrew customs? We do not have clear answers, but here is what we can say with certainty. The circumcision covenant, established with Abraham back in Genesis chapter 17, was the fundamental, non-negotiable mark of belonging to God's people. It was the one physical sign that said, this child is in the covenant. It was so important that God told Abraham any male who was not circumcised shall be cut off from his people. And Moses, the man God had just chosen to lead the entire nation of Israel out of slavery, the man who would deliver the law, had apparently failed to circumcise his own son. The man who would stand on Sinai and receive God's commands had not kept the most basic command in his own household. Think about what that means in modern terms. Think about a doctor who does not give his own kids checkups. Think about a teacher who never reads to his own children. Think about a financial advisor who is personally bankrupt. That is the level of contradiction we are looking at here. And Zipporah's reaction tells us everything we need to know about the state of this marriage. She does not gently remind Moses. She does not wait for him to handle it. She grabs a knife and does it herself, covered in her child's blood, and the words she speaks afterward are not words of partnership. They are words of accusation. You are a bridegroom of blood. This is what being married to you costs. Most scholars believe this incident is directly connected to what happens next, because shortly after this terrifying night at the inn, Moses sends Zipporah and his sons back to Midian. And if you are a parent or a spouse watching this, ask yourself an honest question. Have you ever experienced a moment in your marriage or family where the tension got so bad, where the disagreement about how to raise the kids or how to live the faith became so sharp that someone had to leave? Maybe not physically, maybe emotionally. Maybe one of you shut down. Maybe one of you retreated into their work or their calling because the friction at home had become unbearable. That is what I think happened at the inn. The fight about circumcision, which was really a fight about identity and faith and how their children would be raised, reached a breaking point, and the resolution was separation. Moses went one direction, his family went another. The text does not make a dramatic scene of it. Exodus chapter 18 verse 2 simply notes in retrospect that Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back. The Hebrew word is shiluheha. It comes from the root shalach, which means to send away. This is not a casual goodbye. This is a formal dismissal. The same root word is used elsewhere in the Torah for the sending away of a wife in divorce proceedings. Moses sent his family back to Midian, and then he went on to do everything, all of it. The 10 plagues, the death of the firstborn, the Passover, the crossing of the Red Sea, the pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, the manna in the wilderness, the water from the rock, the giving of the Torah at Sinai, the building of the tabernacle. His family was not there for any of it. Think about what those months must have been like for Gershom and Eliezer back in Midian. News travels in the ancient world. Maybe slowly, maybe through traders and travelers passing through, but it travels. Gershom and Eliezer would have started hearing things. Their father confronted Pharaoh. Their father called down plagues on Egypt. The river turned to blood. Frogs covered the land. Hail rained down from the sky. Darkness covered Egypt for 3 days. And then the big one. The firstborn of every Egyptian family died in a single night. Every household, from the palace to the prison. Their father was at the center of the greatest liberation event in the ancient world, and they were hearing about it secondhand, like reading about a concert your parent performed at from someone else's social media post. Then the sea. They would have heard about the sea, the waters splitting, the Israelites walking through on dry ground, the Egyptian army swallowed by the closing waves, their father standing at the shore with his staff raised, conducting the greatest miracle since creation. Imagine being a teenager or a young man and hearing that your father did that, and you were not there. You were not standing next to him. You were not part of the crowd that sang the song of victory on the other side. You were in Midian, tending your grandfather's sheep, living your father's old life while he was creating an entirely new world without you. Gershom and Eliezer missed the Exodus. They missed the defining event in the entire history of Israel, the moment that would be celebrated every year at Passover for the next 3,000 years. The event that shaped Jewish identity more deeply than any other single moment. The story that every Israelite child would grow up hearing, every year, at every Seder table, for every generation going forward. Moses' own sons were not there. They were in Midian, with their grandfather, while their father was making history without them. And when they finally come back, the reunion in Exodus chapter 18 is one of the coldest family moments in the entire Bible. Jethro hears about everything God has done through Moses. He takes Zipporah and the two boys and travels to the wilderness camp to meet Moses. The text describes Moses going out to greet his father-in-law. He bows down before Jethro. He kisses him. They ask about each other's welfare. They go into the tent, and Moses tells Jethro the whole story, everything God did to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians. Jethro rejoices. Jethro offers sacrifices. Jethro even gives Moses management advice about delegating leadership. But Zipporah? The text does not record Moses greeting her. No embrace, no words of reconciliation, no acknowledgement of the separation or the pain. And Gershom and Eliezer, not a single recorded word. Moses does not hug his sons. He does not ask about their time in Midian. He does not express joy at seeing them. The text captures nothing. Zero emotion toward his own children. The entire passage is about Moses and Jethro. The father-in-law gets the conversation, the meal, the sacrifices, and the management consultation. The wife and sons get silence. If this were a film, the camera would slowly drift from the warm firelight of Moses and Jethro's conversation to two boys standing at the edge of the tent flap, watching their father laugh and talk with their grandfather about a God they experienced secondhand, about miracles they only heard about a national story they were not invited to be part of. Nobody asks them how they feel. And here is something I want you to think about. The text of Exodus chapter 18 takes 27 verses to describe Jethro's visit. 27 verses. Jethro gets a warm greeting, a detailed account of the Exodus, a shared meal, a sacrifice to God, and a management consultation that restructures the entire judicial system of Israel. It is one of the longest single-visit narratives in the Torah. Zipporah and the two sons? They appear in verse 2 and then vanish. By verse 5, the focus has shifted entirely to Jethro. And for the remaining 22 verses, the wife and children of Moses are furniture in the room. 27 verses for the visit, not a single one describing Moses embracing his sons. If the Bible is a document that records what matters, and I believe it is, then what does this ratio tell us about what mattered in this moment? The political relationship between Moses and Jethro mattered. The administrative restructuring of Israel mattered. The theological conversation between the two men mattered. The father-son reunion? The husband-wife reconciliation? Those apparently did not rise to the level of deserving ink. Or maybe, and this is the harder interpretation, maybe the reason those moments are not recorded is that they were too painful to describe. Maybe there was no warm embrace. Maybe there was no reconciliation. Maybe the reunion was exactly as awkward and cold as the text makes it look, and the authors chose silence over narrating something that would have reflected badly on the greatest prophet who ever lived. Either way, what the text does not say tells us more than what it does. Now I want to pause here, because this is not just ancient literature. This is happening right now today, in households all over the world. How many of you grew up with a parent who was so consumed by their work, their career, their calling, their ministry, their mission, that the family became an afterthought? How many of you know what it is like to be in the same room as someone and still feel completely invisible? How many of you have carried a family name, a reputation, a legacy that has absolutely nothing to do with who you actually are as a person? Gershom and Eliezer are not just minor characters in an ancient text. They are the original preacher's kids, the original missionary kids, the original children of a parent whose relationship with God was so intense, so all-consuming, so world-historically important that the human relationships closest to them withered in the shadow of it. There is a phrase that gets used in ministry circles, PKS, preacher's kids. And everyone who has been around churches for any length of time knows the stereotype. The preacher's kid who rebels, the pastor's daughter who walks away from faith, the missionary's son who wants nothing to do with God by the time he is 18. People treat this like a mystery. They wonder what went wrong. They blame the culture, the church, the devil, the child. But the story of Gershom and Eliezer suggests something simpler and more painful. Sometimes the parent was so consumed by their calling that the child was left without enough of them to form their own relationship with the God their parents served. It is not that Moses was a bad person. He was arguably the best person in the entire Old Testament, the most faithful, the most courageous, the most intimate with God. But being the best prophet does not automatically make you a good father. And the skills that make someone great at their calling, the focus, the intensity, the willingness to sacrifice everything for the mission, those same qualities can make them terrible at being present for their children. This is a tension that the Bible refuses to resolve. It just presents both realities side by side. Moses saved Israel. Moses lost his sons. Both things are true, and the text will not let you pretend one cancels out the other. And the Bible, to its enormous credit, does not pretend this did not happen. It does not airbrush the family portrait. It records the names. It records the separation. It records the cold reunion. And then it lets the silence do the rest. Because sometimes silence is the loudest part of the story. There is a Jewish teaching tradition that says silence in the Torah is never accidental. When the text omits something, it is making a choice. It is drawing attention to the absence the way a painter might leave a section of canvas deliberately blank. The blank space is not a mistake. It is the composition. It is the message. The silence around Gershom and Eliezer is the canvas showing through. And what it reveals, if you are willing to look at it honestly, is a family that was fractured by divine purpose. A household that was broken open so that an entire nation could be set free. And the text will not let you feel good about either side of that equation. It will not let you celebrate the Exodus without noticing the empty seats where Gershom and Eliezer should have been sitting. And it will not let you mourn the family without remembering that 2 million people walked out of slavery because their father said yes to the bush. Now we need to talk about the priesthood, because this is where the gap in Moses' family narrative shifts from personally sad to theologically seismic. When God establishes the tabernacle worship system in the book of Exodus, the system that will define Israelite religious life for the next several centuries, he needs to appoint priests. These will be the men who stand between God and the people. They will offer the sacrifices on behalf of the nation. They will enter the holy places where God's presence dwells. They will wear the sacred vestments. They will carry the Urim and Thummim, the mysterious objects used to discern God's will. They will handle the most sacred objects in the world. The priesthood was the single highest spiritual office in the nation, higher than king because Israel does not have a king yet, higher than prophet because the priest stands in God's presence daily while the prophet receives occasional words. The crown jewel of spiritual authority in all of Israel. And who does God choose for this office? Aaron's sons, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. Aaron's line, Aaron's descendants, forever. Not Moses' sons, not Gershom, not Eliezer. Now, if your first thought is, well, Aaron was already the priest, so obviously his sons would follow, that is a reasonable surface reading. But pull back for a second and look at this from a purely human angle. Moses is the leader. Moses is the one who talks to God face to face, which Exodus chapter 33 makes explicit. No other human being in the Old Testament has that kind of access. Moses is the mediator of the covenant. Moses delivers every law, every ordinance, every statute that structures Israelite life. Moses has 2 sons who are of age, who are Levites by tribal affiliation, who are available, and God says no. The spiritual inheritance goes to your brother's family. In any royal court in the ancient world, in any political system, in any family dynasty, the leader's sons inherit. That is how it works. That is how it always works. Egyptian pharaohs spent decades securing the succession for their sons. Mesopotamian kings waged wars to put their sons on thrones. The entire ancient Near Eastern political order was built on the idea that authority flows from father to son. God shatters that expectation with Moses, and the instructions go further. Exodus and Leviticus make the priesthood hereditary through Aaron's line permanently. The covenant of the priesthood belongs to Aaron and his descendants forever. Numbers chapter 25 verse 13 uses the word olam, meaning perpetual or eternal. Aaron's grandson Phinehas receives an eternal covenant of priesthood. Moses' sons are locked out permanently, not for a season, not for a generation, forever. Think about Gershom and Eliezer standing in the camp, watching their cousins, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar and Ithamar, being consecrated as priests, watching their uncle Aaron put on the sacred vestments, the breastplate with 12 stones representing the 12 tribes, the turban with the golden plate that reads, "Holy to the Lord," the robe with golden bells along its hem that chime as Aaron walks into God's presence. Gershom and Eliezer watched all of this. These were their relatives, their family, and the message was unmistakable. Your father built this nation. Your father delivered the law that governs this priesthood. Your father is the reason any of this exists, and you will never stand where your cousins stand. The text never tells us how they felt about it, and that absence says more than any recorded complaint ever could. Imagine what that must have been like. Moses, standing inside the cloud of God's presence on Mount Sinai, receiving day after day of detailed instruction about the tabernacle, the dimensions, the materials, the furniture, the curtains, and then the priesthood, the vestments, the consecration rituals, the daily offerings, and every single instruction involves Aaron, Aaron and his sons, Aaron's descendants, Aaron's lineage. Moses receives all these instructions about a spiritual office that his own sons will never hold. I want you to think about a modern parallel. Imagine you build a company from nothing. You pour your life into it. You sacrifice your family time, your health, your personal life. The company becomes enormously successful. And then the board of directors announces that the CEO position will pass not to your children, but to your brother's children. And you have to be the one who announces it. That is roughly what Moses experienced, except the company was an entire nation. The board of directors was God Almighty, and the CEO position was the eternal priesthood. The text never records Moses objecting. It never records him asking, "What about my sons?" It never records him expressing disappointment or confusion or pain. But absence of a recorded complaint does not mean absence of feeling. Moses was human. He was a father. He had 2 boys who would have been fully eligible for priestly service, and he watched the entire spiritual inheritance of Israel pass to Aaron's family without a word. But here is where the detective work gets really interesting, because Moses' sons being bypassed is not an anomaly in the Bible. It is a pattern, and once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. God has a habit, a deliberate and consistent habit, of bypassing the expected heir. Abraham has Ishmael first. By every legal and cultural standard of the ancient world, Ishmael is the rightful heir. He is the firstborn son. He is 13 years older than Isaac. Abraham loves him. Abraham pleads with God to let Ishmael be the one. Genesis chapter 17, verse 18. Abraham says, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." He is begging God to let the firstborn inherit the covenant. God says no. The covenant goes through Isaac, the younger, the one who came later, the one who, from a human standpoint, had less claim. Isaac has twin sons, Esau and Jacob. Esau comes out of the womb first, literally. He is minutes older. By every legal standard in the ancient Near East, the birthright belongs to Esau. He is the firstborn. It is his by right. God says no. Before the twins are even born, God tells Rebekah, "The older will serve the younger." The covenant passes to Jacob, the second son, the schemer, the grabber. Jacob has 12 sons. Reuben is the firstborn. By every expectation, Reuben should lead the family into the next generation. But Reuben loses his place. The line of the Messiah goes through Judah, the 4th son. The double portion of inheritance goes to Joseph, the 11th son. The priesthood goes to Levi, the 3rd son. The firstborn gets bypassed 3 different ways. And then David. Jesse has 8 sons. When the prophet Samuel comes to anoint the next king, Jesse lines up his boys. The eldest first, tall, strong, impressive looking. Samuel looks at the oldest son and thinks, surely this is God's anointed. God says no. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And God keeps saying no. Son after son after son, until Jesse sends for the youngest, the runt, the one tending sheep, the one he did not even bother to bring inside. David, the eighth son, the last, the least. Do you see it now? Do you see what God is doing across the entire Old Testament? He is systematically, deliberately, almost stubbornly refusing to let spiritual authority pass through the expected human line. Ishmael bypassed, Esau bypassed, Reuben bypassed, Jesse's older sons bypassed, and Moses' sons bypassed. It happens so consistently that you start to wonder if God is making a point, and I think he is. The point is that the kingdom of God does not run on nepotism. It does not run on pedigree. It does not run on the assumption that a great father automatically produces a great son. Every single time the human expectation says the firstborn inherits, God disrupts the pattern. Every single time the cultural norm says the leader's son takes the throne, God intervenes and chooses someone else, someone unexpected, someone overlooked, someone who would never have been selected by any human committee. And this is not God being random or cruel. This is God protecting the integrity of calling itself. Because the moment spiritual authority becomes hereditary, it stops being about God and starts being about family politics. The moment the priesthood becomes a family business, the fire goes out and the routine takes over. The moment leadership passes by bloodline instead of by calling, you get managers instead of prophets. God keeps disrupting the hereditary line because he refuses to let his purposes be domesticated into human institutions. He keeps choosing the unexpected heir because the moment people think they can predict who God will use, they stop listening for his actual voice. This is a critical point, so let me make sure it lands. In the human world, authority is inherited. In God's world, authority is called. You get power because of who your father was in the human system. In God's system, you get a role because God looked at you, specifically you, and said, I have something for you, not because of your bloodline, not because of your family name, not because of your birth order. You do not become a priest because your father was Moses. You become a priest because God says, you. Moses' sons were not rejected. That word is important. They were not disqualified. They were not punished. They were simply not called. And there is a canyon of difference between rejection and the absence of a specific calling. Rejection says you are not good enough. The absence of calling says God has something different in mind for you. Those are two completely different realities, and confusing them has caused more unnecessary pain in more families than almost any other theological misunderstanding. Now, if you are watching this and you grew up in a family with a strong spiritual legacy, where your parents were pastors or missionaries or deeply committed leaders in the faith, this probably hits close to home. Because the unspoken expectation in those families, and sometimes the very spoken expectation, is that you will carry the torch. You will continue what they started. You will be the next generation of the dynasty. And if you do not feel that same calling, if the fire that burned in your parents does not burn in you the same way, the guilt can be absolutely crushing. You feel like you are failing them, failing God, failing your family name. You feel like Gershom, like a stranger in a land that is supposed to be yours but does not feel like it. But look at what the Bible actually shows us. Moses' sons were not called to the priesthood, and that was not a failure. That was God being God, choosing people for his purposes on his terms, not on the terms of human expectation or family tradition. Your parents' calling is not your inheritance. It was never supposed to be. Now, if you know your Bible well, you might be thinking, wait, Moses' sons are not completely invisible. They do show up in one other place, and you are right. 1 Chronicles chapter 23, verses 14 through 17, lists them in a genealogy of Levitical families organized under King David. Gershom's descendant Shebuel is listed as a family leader. Eliezer's son Rehabiah is noted as having numerous descendants. They are there. But look at what that passage actually says. Look at the context. It is a bureaucratic inventory, a census of Levitical work crews for the temple. Moses' grandsons and great-grandsons are listed alongside dozens of other Levitical families as managers, custodians, administrators. They count inventory. They maintain the courtyards. They handle logistics. From Moses, who stood in the fire on Sinai and spoke with God face to face, to Shebuel, who managed the temple storeroom. That is not a rebuttal to the erasure. That is the erasure explained. They were not erased from history. They were demoted by it. They went from the peak of spiritual authority to organizational middle management in 2 generations. And the chronicler records this without commentary, without emotion, without even acknowledging the staggering distance between Moses and his grandchildren's job descriptions. Sometimes showing up on a list is worse than not showing up at all, because the list makes the gap visible. It puts a measurement on the fall. If you are discovering things in the biblical text that you have never noticed before, hit subscribe. Every week we go back to the original Hebrew and Greek and find what gets lost in translation. The stuff that changes how you read the Bible and how you read your own life. Now, here is where this investigation takes its darkest turn. And I have to warn you, what comes next is the part that most Bible teachers either do not know about or deliberately avoid. For good reason. Because what happened to Moses' family line after his death is one of the most disturbing revelations in the entire Old Testament. We need to go to the book of Judges. Chapters 17 and 18. Deep in the middle of a book that is already full of chaos, moral collapse, and spiritual anarchy. And what we find there is going to reframe everything we have discussed so far. Judges 17 opens with a man named Micah. He lives in the hill country of Ephraim, and the story starts with a confession. Micah stole 1,100 pieces of silver from his own mother. When he admits to it, his mother pronounces a blessing on him, takes 200 of the silver pieces, and gives them to a silversmith to make a carved image and a cast idol. An idol, made from silver, set up in an Israelite household. During the period when the Torah, delivered by Moses himself, explicitly commands, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image." Micah sets up a personal shrine in his house. He makes an ephod, which is a priestly garment, and teraphim, which are household gods. Then he installs one of his own sons as the priest of this unauthorized, illegal, idolatrous shrine. The book of Judges adds a refrain that repeats throughout these chapters, a refrain that functions like a disclaimer. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This is the author telling us that the spiritual infrastructure Moses built was collapsing. The law was being ignored, the covenant was being broken, and people were improvising their own religion. Then a young Levite arrives. He is wandering, looking for a place to settle. He comes from Bethlehem in Judah. Micah sees an opportunity. Having a real Levite as his priest would be a major upgrade from his unqualified son, so Micah offers the young man a deal. "Stay with me, be a father and a priest to me. I will give you 10 pieces of silver a year, a set of clothes, and your food." The Levite accepts. Micah is thrilled. He says, "Now I know the Lord will prosper me, because I have a Levite as priest." Think about the layers of irony here. This Levite, who we will soon learn is Moses' grandson, is being hired to serve a carved idol. His grandfather was the man who shattered the golden calf at the foot of Sinai. His grandfather was the man who received the commandment, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image," written by God's own finger. And here is his descendant living in a house with a carved image, wearing a homemade ephod, serving as a priest for hire to a man who thinks God can be bought with the right religious employee. The decline from Moses to Jonathan is not a gentle slope, it is a cliff. But the story is not done, because in chapter 18 the tribe of Dan enters the picture. The Danites have a problem. Their tribal allotment is being contested. They have not been able to fully possess the land assigned to them, so they send 5 scouts north to find new territory. These scouts pass through the hill country of Ephraim and stop at Micah's house. They recognize the young Levite's accent, his southern dialect. They ask him what he is doing there. He explains. The scouts ask him to inquire of God. Will our mission succeed? The Levite tells them to go in peace, that the Lord approves their journey. The scouts find a city called Laish in the far north, peaceful, unsuspecting, far from any military alliance, an easy target. They report back to the tribe. 600 armed Danites march north. They pass through Micah's territory again. And this time, they do not just visit. They enter the shrine, take the carved image, the ephod, the teraphim, the cast idol. They steal everything. When the Levite protests, they make him an offer he apparently cannot refuse. Be quiet, come with us. Would you rather be priest to one man's household or priest to an entire tribe of Israel? The text tells us something chilling in its simplicity. The priest's heart was glad. He took the ephod, the teraphim, and the carved image, and he went with the Danites. He did not hesitate. He did not pray about it. He did not consult God. His heart was glad. He was being promoted from a personal chaplain to a tribal priest, and that was enough. The Danites conquer Laish, rename it Dan, and set up the stolen idol as their tribal worship center. And then, almost as a footnote, as if the author has been building to this moment the entire time and wants to drop it like a bomb, the text reveals the identity of this Levite. Judges chapter 18, verse 30. And the people of Dan set up the carved image for themselves. And Jonathan, the son of Gershom, son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribe of the Danites until the day of the captivity of the land. Jonathan, son of Gershom, son of Moses, Moses' grandson, the grandson of the man who received the 10 Commandments on tablets of stone, the grandson of the man who smashed the golden calf in righteous fury when he came down from the mountain and found Israel worshipping an idol, the grandson of the man who stood in the gap between God's wrath and Israel's sin and begged God not to destroy them. That man's direct blood descendant became the hired priest of a stolen idol at an unauthorized shrine, and he did it gladly, and his sons continued doing it for generations, 3 generations. That is all it took for the family line to go from the peak of spiritual authority to the depths of spiritual corruption. Moses, who talked to God face to face. Gershom, who said nothing and did nothing that the text records. Jonathan, who served carved images with a glad heart. 3 generations. Sociologists have a concept they call shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The first generation builds the wealth. The second generation maintains it but does not fully understand what it cost. The third generation squanders it. Business families observe this pattern all the time. The founder builds the empire. The children manage it. The grandchildren lose it. What happened in Moses' family is the spiritual version of that same pattern. Moses encountered God directly and was transformed. Gershom inherited the name, but apparently not the encounter. Jonathan inherited neither, and the mechanism of the decline is visible in the text if you know where to look. Moses' relationship with God was direct and personal. He stood in the fire, he heard the voice, he climbed the mountain. Gershom and Eliezer were sent away during the very events that would have forged that kind of direct encounter. They missed the plagues, they missed the sea, they missed Sinai. They got the stories secondhand. By the time Jonathan came along, Moses was a legend, not a grandfather who told stories by the fire. Moses was the name on the law, not the man who wrestled with God in a tent of meeting. The relationship had become information. The encounter had become tradition, and tradition without encounter is just culture, and culture without fire is just habit. And habit without conviction can be redirected toward anything, even a carved idol. This is the anatomy of spiritual decline in a family, and it has repeated itself in every generation since. Jonathan's family served as priests of that idol in Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. That most likely refers to the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom in 722 BC, which means this idolatrous priesthood, founded by Moses' own grandson, operated for centuries, generations of Moses' descendants serving a carved image. Now, here is the detail that reveals just how devastating this was for the people who preserved the Hebrew text. And this is the part that separates this video from every other video you have seen on this topic. In the original Hebrew manuscript of Judges chapter 18 verse 30, the name is not written cleanly. If you look at the ancient Hebrew text, there is a letter nun that appears to be written above the line, suspended, hanging in the air between the other letters. When you read the name with the nun included, it spells Menashe, Manasseh. When you read it without the suspended nun, reading only the original consonants at the normal line height, it spells Moshe, Moses. The scribes inserted that letter. They changed the name. This is documented in the Talmud. It is discussed in the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Bava Batra. The rabbis knew exactly what had been done and why. The scribes were so horrified, so ashamed by the idea that Moses' grandson had become a priest of idols, that they attempted to redirect the genealogy. By adding one letter, they could make it appear that Jonathan was descended from King Manasseh of Judah rather than from Moses. And the choice of Manasseh was strategic. King Manasseh, who reigned in Judah centuries later, was famous for his idolatry. 2 Kings chapter 21 says Manasseh set up altars to Baal inside the temple of God. He put an idol in the holy place. He practiced divination and sorcery. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord. So the scribal logic was this: Jonathan the idol priest must be from Manasseh's line, not Moses' line. An idolater descending from an idolater makes sense. An idolater descending from the lawgiver is unbearable. But they could not bring themselves to fully rewrite the text. They could not fully lie about the word of God, even to protect the reputation of the greatest prophet who ever lived. So they left the nun suspended, floating above the word like a flag, like a footnote visible only to those reading carefully enough to notice. It is one of the most extraordinary acts of editorial conscience in the history of any sacred text. The scribes tried to protect Moses, and then they left evidence of their own deception visible for anyone paying attention. They simultaneously hid the truth and preserved it. Think about the position these scribes were in. They believed the text was holy. They believed every letter mattered. They believed that altering God's word was one of the gravest sins imaginable. And yet the truth in the text, that Moses' grandson was an idolater, was so painful that they felt compelled to act. So they found a middle way. They could not delete the verse. They could not rewrite the genealogy, but they could add one tiny letter, smaller than a fingernail on the scroll, and suspend it just above the line where it would change the reading for anyone who did not look closely. It was the ancient equivalent of redacting a document but leaving the black marker slightly transparent. If you hold it up to the light, you can still read what is underneath. And that is exactly what happened. Careful readers noticed. Rabbis discussed it. And the truth survived despite the attempt to soften it. This tells us something profound about how the biblical authors and later scribes understood the text they were preserving. They were not propagandists. They were not spinning a narrative. They were custodians of truth who sometimes found the truth almost unbearable. And the suspended nun in Judges 18 verse 30 has become one of the most studied scribal anomalies in the entire Hebrew Bible. It is taught in rabbinical schools. It is discussed in academic papers. It is proof that the people who preserved the Bible took it seriously enough to struggle with it. And now, suddenly, everything we have discussed makes sense. The way Gershom and Eliezer vanish from the narrative is not carelessness. It is not a gap in the record. It is a deliberate editorial strategy. If you were writing the sacred history of Israel and you knew that the lawgiver's grandson became an idol priest, how would you handle it? You cannot delete the judge's account entirely because it explains the origin of the Dan sanctuary, which matters for the history of the northern tribes. But you can minimize the setup. You can keep Moses' sons invisible in the earlier narrative so that the judge's revelation arrives without preparation, without foreshadowing, without the reader having invested emotionally in Gershom's story. The omission is not accidental. It is editorial mercy. The biblical authors knew how the story ended, and they protected Moses and Gershom and Eliezer, and even Jonathan, by wrapping the early chapters in quiet. There is a word in Hebrew that is often translated as loving kindness or mercy or steadfast love. The word is chesed. It is one of the most theologically rich words in the entire Hebrew Bible. It describes the kind of love that protects even when the truth is painful, the kind of mercy that covers shame without denying it. I believe the silence around Moses' sons is an act of chesed built into the architecture of the Bible itself. The authors could have told us everything, they chose not to. And that restraint, that deliberate withholding, is as theologically significant as anything they wrote. Now let me bring all of this home, because this investigation has been about Moses and Gershom and Eliezer and Jonathan, but it has also been about you, about every person watching who has ever wondered whether their family will carry forward what matters most, and about every person watching who has felt the crushing weight of a legacy they did not choose. Here is what the evidence tells us. You cannot inherit a relationship with God. This is the first and most important lesson from the story of Moses' sons. Moses had the most intimate divine relationship in the Old Testament. He saw God's glory. He heard God's voice. He spent 40 days on the mountain in God's presence. He argued with God. He pleaded with God. He wept before God. He knew God the way you know your closest friend. But none of that transferred to Gershom. None of it transferred to Eliezer, and none of it prevented Jonathan from cheerfully serving a carved idol for the rest of his life. A relationship with God is not a family heirloom. You cannot put it in a trust fund. You cannot pass it down in a will. You cannot install it in your children like software on a computer. Every generation has to encounter God for themselves. Every person has to hear their own burning bush. Every individual has to climb their own mountain and hear their own voice. Your parents' faith can create an environment where encountering God is possible. It can open doors of understanding. It can model what devotion looks like day after day. But it absolutely cannot do the encountering for you. And when parents confuse creating an environment with guaranteeing an outcome, everybody suffers. Moses could give his sons names that testified to God's faithfulness, but he could not give them his burning bush. He could not hand them Sinai in a box. He could not force them to see what he saw in the fire. If you are a parent, this should free you, not scare you, free you, because it means the outcome of your children's spiritual lives is not entirely on your shoulders. You are responsible for the environment. You are responsible for being present, for being honest, for being available. But the encounter is between your child and God, and you cannot control that any more than Moses could. And if you are a child or an adult child who never had the encounter your parents had, who never felt the fire they felt, who never experienced the faith that seemed to come so naturally to them, this should free you too. It does not mean something is wrong with you. It means God meets people individually, on His own terms, on His own timeline, and your story is not finished. Your calling and your family are not the same project. This is the second lesson. Moses clearly sacrificed his family for his mission. The evidence is all through the text. The names that point to his pain, not his children's potential. The sending away of Zipporah and the boys. The cold reunion in Exodus 18. The total absence of his sons from the remaining narrative. All of it points to a man who chose the mission over the family, and the Bible does not condemn him for that choice. But it also does not hide the cost. The cost was 2 sons who became invisible. The cost was a grandson who became an idol priest. The cost was a family line that collapsed into the very idolatry Moses spent his life fighting against. If you are someone driven by a calling, a career, a mission, a ministry that consumes most of your energy and attention, this should give you pause, not stop you, not make you abandon your purpose, but pause, because Moses saved a nation and lost a family. And the Bible records both realities as equally true without pretending one erases the other. There is no verse in the Bible that says, "And Moses' sacrifice of his family was worth it because he saved Israel." The text never makes that calculation. It never offers that comfort. It simply presents both facts. He delivered a nation. His grandson served idols, and it refuses to tell you which outcome weighed more on the scales. I think the reason the Bible refuses to resolve this tension is because it wants you to sit with it. It wants you to feel the weight of both truths at the same time. Because the moment you decide that the mission was worth the family cost, you give yourself permission to make the same trade. And the moment you decide the family should have come first, you question whether the Exodus should have happened at all. The Bible will not let you off the hook. It holds both realities in tension because real life holds them in tension. And wisdom is not choosing one over the other. Wisdom is holding both and proceeding with open eyes. Silence about your children is not always neglect. Sometimes it is grace. Every parent with a child who has walked away from the faith, who has made choices that break the parent's heart, who has gone in a direction the parent never imagined or wanted, every one of those parents knows the temptation to tell the story publicly, to explain what went wrong, to defend their own parenting, to assign blame. The biblical authors could have told us exactly how Gershom raised Jonathan. They could have documented the theological decline step by step. They could have analyzed what Moses did wrong as a father and drawn explicit lessons from it. They did not. They let the absence stand. And in that restraint, there is a dignity that gossip and analysis would have destroyed. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do with a painful family story is let it rest. Not pretend it did not happen, but let it rest. Give the people involved the mercy of not having their worst chapters narrated for an audience. What the Bible withholds about Moses' sons is not the absence of story. It is the presence of mercy. God's purposes are bigger than any bloodline. This is maybe the most important thing the story teaches. The entire Old Testament seems to be building toward the idea that the right family line will produce the right outcome. And then God disrupts that expectation over and over again. Moses' sons did not carry his legacy into the next generation, but Israel carried Moses' legacy. The Torah carried Moses' legacy. The synagogues that would be built in every city in the ancient world carried Moses' legacy. Every church that reads from the first 5 books of the Bible is carrying Moses' legacy. Every person who has ever prayed the words of Psalm 90, the only psalm attributed to Moses, is engaging with a legacy that transcended bloodlines entirely. Moses' impact did not need his biological sons. It outlived them, outgrew them, and reached people they could never have imagined. And that brings us to the question I have been building toward this entire video. The real question is not why were Moses' sons erased from history. The real question is, what is God writing with your life? Not your parents' story, not your family name, not the legacy someone else built and expects you to maintain. Your story, the one that belongs to you alone. If you are a parent watching this, your children are not your legacy project. They are their own people with their own callings and their own encounters with God to have or not have. The best thing you can do is love them. Be present for them in a way that Moses, consumed by his mission, may not have been fully present for Gershom and Eliezer. And then trust that God will meet your children on their own road, even if that road looks nothing like yours. And if you are someone who has been carrying the weight of a parent's expectations, whether those expectations are spiritual, professional, academic, or personal, hear this clearly. Gershom's name meant stranger in a foreign land. But that was his father's wound, not his identity. And you are not obligated to carry your parents' wounds as your name tag. You get your own name, you get your own bush, you get your own encounter with whatever is holy and true and worth building a life around. And if that encounter has not come yet, that does not mean it will not come. Moses was 80 years old when God spoke from that bush. 80. 40 years of silence in the desert. 40 years of herding someone else's sheep in someone else's land, with a wound so deep he named his firstborn son after it. And then one ordinary afternoon, a bush caught fire and did not burn. And everything changed. Everything. Your bush might be a long time coming. But the story of Moses and his silent sons proves something that every generation desperately needs to hear. God does not work through family timelines. He does not run on human expectations. He operates on his own schedule in his own way, calling people by name and never once by pedigree. Moses' sons were not erased because they did not matter. They were quiet in the narrative because their story was not the story God was telling through them. And that is not a tragedy. That is freedom. Because it means your story is not determined by who came before you. It is determined by who calls you forward. And maybe that is the most beautiful thing about the silence around Moses' sons. The silence leaves room for God to write something new, room for each generation to encounter the divine on their own terms, room for you, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever family you come from, to hear your own name spoken from your own burning bush. Moses' sons were silent in the text, but your story does not have to be silent. Your chapter has not been written yet, and the God who could call an 80-year-old shepherd from a burning bush in the middle of nowhere is not limited by your family history, your past mistakes, or the expectations other people have placed on you. The bush is still burning. The voice is still speaking. The only question is whether you will turn aside and listen. If this video changed how you read a Bible passage you thought you already understood, hit subscribe. Every week, we go back to the original Hebrew and Greek and pull out the things that disappear in translation, the things that change how you read the text and how you live your life. The video on screen right now covers another buried story in the Old Testament that most people have never heard. Click it. You will not look at the Bible the same way afterward.